We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program former U.S. Representative for North Carolina's 13th Congressional District, serving from 2003 to 2013, and writing in the fall 2019, the American Prospect, The 40-Year War, William Barr's Long Struggle Against Congressional Oversight. Welcome to the program, Brad.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
I have to tell you that in addition to being, some of this being reliving some of my youth in terms of your piece, the thing that really struck me, and we'll get into it in more detail, but I just have to say off the top, is the Office of Legal Counsel. I did not have a sense of how messed
Powerful?
up of how powerful. Well, I
And
did have a sense
sinister?
of how powerful, but how like so easy it is to corrupt it in some ways. But let's before we get there, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. But you write that William Barr, this has been part of, and he is part of, a 40-year project to essentially strengthen the power of the president. I imagine that's been an ongoing battle since day one on some level, but we've entered into a new era of it.
We have, and I think for Trump, it's obviously not doctrinal. It's entirely opportunistic. He doesn't think about constitutional architecture, which is the phrase that constitutional scholars use for separation of powers and checks and balances. It is entirely in his interest at the moment. So he thinks about it about as much as my dog thinks about whether to lick his own penis.
Right.
It serves his immediate needs. What to think about? But for Barr and for others on the right, there has been a consistent plan, a consistent effort over the last 40 years at least, to create a very powerful executive and a very weak, well, really both the courts and Congress lose power to the president under their interpretation, and their preferred their preferred political system, their system of government, but especially Congress.
Well, I want to dig into the various examples over the course of these 40 years that you talk about, but I felt sort of mystified, and I knew vaguely about Bill Barr in his involvement back in the Iran-Contra days. But when that 16-page memo of his that he wrote saying that Trump was really incapable of being investigated or at least held to account because he was president. I mean, since that time, I've been sort of baffled about. Here's a guy who's retired. Where does this doctrine come from? I mean, like, is he part of some type of like secret Straussian cult? I mean, what, like honestly, like, I just like wonder, like, I don't understand that type of belief set.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think they all get together in secret and perform rituals. But there is almost a cult-like belief in a strong executive, and it really the line between the very strong executive elected by the people and strongman rule is really a pretty blurry line. And the idea of democracy, that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, was a radical idea back then in the 18th century, and it's still a radical idea. And not everyone accepts it. And it's a radical idea of the left, not of the right.
People should remember that, originally senators were not popularly elected, and so on.
And actually, neither were presidents. They fully expected the electoral college to be a deliberative body. They did not think it was logistically possible to elect presidents by popular vote because there's no way in the world someone from Georgia would know anything about someone from New York.
Right. I mean, and on some level, like that makes sense to me in terms of like a certain practicality. It's just hard for me to imagine that there are people who feel like the best thing for America is for us to have a, quasi-dictator type of situation.
A man on horseback, yes.
But those people exist, so we got to take them at their word. Let's go back. I mean, you cite through some early history ranging from George Washington's first term to Woodrow Wilson saying that informing the informing function of Congress should be preferred even to its legislative function. In other words, things like oversight and whatnot. And really, this turn really happened under the Reagan administration. Lay out for us, how it was that Reagan assembled these people, but it really goes back. I mean, before this, right, where Dick Cheney sort of, learned this concept under Nixon. Right.
Yeah, it goes back to the Nixon administration, and Nixonian has become a term used for extreme claims of presidential power. And after Watergate, there were reforms, important reforms. The Inspector General statute, which is what led us to the Ukraine scandal and the possibility now of the very real possibility of impeachment, was a post-Watergate reform. So was the special counsel law. There were there were several important reforms that were designed to rein in the imperial presidency. And for Barr and for Edwin Meese and for others who were part of that group of rightist lawyers who came into the Reagan administration, both in the White House and in the Department of Justice, there was a sense that the Watergate reforms had gone way too far, and that the just powers, the proper powers of the presidency needed to be needed to be restored. But in fact, they went much beyond that. Edwin Meese gave speeches that suggested that the president could disregard opinions of the Supreme Court with which he disagreed, that independent agencies were an intrusion on the president's power over the executive branch, despite Supreme Court cases saying that independent agencies within the executive branch were perfectly okay. And that was sort of where this began, was with the Reagan administration, and they began picking fights that went badly for them at first.
All right. Well, let's talk about those fights because the first one was a function of executive privilege. Now, this concept of executive privilege, did this come out of case law? I mean, where does this derived? Because it over the course of the inquiries into Donald Trump, we've seen a lot of times where the executive does not seem to be calling for executive privilege, but those working for him cite it, even though it has not been initiated, I guess. They just sort of think they shouldn't talk about it. Just give us a little background on executive privilege, and then we can go into the attempt by the EPA to withhold documents from Congress back in the early 80s.
It's pretty ill-defined. Presidents in the 20th century, I think Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower, both said that they would instruct employees, officials of the executive branch, not to answer certain questions that went to their communications with the president. That the confidentiality of communications with the president, so the president could make decisions with the best advice because the advice was uninhibited. I mean, that's been around for a while. It has not really been recognized by the courts until the Watergate cases and the Nixon administration, I guess one in particular, and it's never really been very well defined. But the courts acknowledge that there probably are some communications between some high-level officials and the president that should be regarded as privileged. But even that is subject to being overridden if there is an obvious need for the information. And they do. And in my experience as an oversight subcommittee chair for 4 years, the executive does just throw that out there anytime they don't want to answer a question. But early on in the Reagan administration, there was a scandal that came out of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The head then was Ann Gorsuch Burford. Yes, she is Neil Gorsuch's mother, or was. And she was head of it, and there was a question about the Superfund, the legislation to clean up waste sites, particularly contaminated waste sites. And there was a question about whether there was corruption and how that program was being administered and the funds were being spent. And three House committees got whistleblower information and issued subpoenas, and the Reagan administration folks at the White House and the DOJ told her not to provide the information but to assert executive privilege. And then they had litigation over that, and the court said, this is not the time to raise this. The time to raise this is when she is defending the criminal charges for contempt of Congress. And she said, what? What was this about criminal charges? And she just folded, and they lost that battle. They lost it pretty resoundingly, and Congress got all the documents. The person under Gorsuch, her name was Rita Lavelle, who headed the Superfund program, ended up being fired, then convicted of perjury, and she served an active prison sentence for perjury for what she had said to Congress. And then the House, the Judiciary Committee, opened an investigation into how the Department of Justice had handled their investigation and whether they had obstructed the Department of Justice had obstructed the House investigation, and whether high officials in the Department of Justice had committed perjury in fighting the investigation. So things just kind of unraveled for the Reagan administration in their attempt to put Congress in their place at the time.
Well, I mean, the idea of someone lying to Congress and going to jail for it, the idea of Congress investigating the Department of Justice, those things seem so far removed from where we are today, because, what you're outlining is like I feel like all this stuff happened like, I don't know, 2 years ago under this president, right? I mean, we have the EPA refusing to hand over documents, it feels like, every couple of weeks. We've seen people just in their nomination hearings lie to Congress. I mean, but yet we have none of those. I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but these tools seem to have gone away.
Well, I've wondered about that. Why is it so different now that they can just thumb their nose at Congress, just flout Congress's oversight powers? And my article in American Prospect was written before the whole Ukraine stuff hit. But every day are new examples of what I wrote about in the American Prospect piece. I think one important thing that has changed, in addition just the change in the norms and how tribal the partisanship is now, and how much negative partisanship there is, because I don't necessarily like my guys, but I hate your guys, is that the special counsel law enacted after Watergate sunset at the end of the Clinton administration, the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, because Democrats by that point hated it because of how many investigations there had been under Clinton, and the Republicans had always hated it. It had been what had brought the Iran-Contra stuff to light, and it made it impossible for the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, to make that go away. And the old law had a hair trigger requirement to report upon demand by Congress, at least, report any evidence of possible criminal misconduct by executive branch officials to the District of Columbia federal court to appoint a special prosecutor, so the special prosecutor would investigate and perhaps prosecute because of a possible conflict of interest. That's expired.
And to be clear, that was the independent counsel law. We can still have special counsels, but those are appointed by the Department of Justice, like we had with Robert Mueller.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, it was called an independent counsel law. That's correct. And they were appointed by the court itself. The Department of Justice had to provide them resources, but they acted independently with all the powers of the Department of Justice, and that expired. And in the Ann Gorsuch-Burford matter, the Department of Justice said, we don't have to prosecute her. I mean, the statute says that we have to, but we don't have to. It's an inherent power of the president to prosecute or not. But there was sitting out there that independent counsel law, and Congress could have required the court to appoint a special prosecutor, an independent counsel, to proceed or not. And that's expired. And I think since then, and certainly what is happening now, everyone involved knows there's no way in the world the Department of Justice, the Barr Department of Justice, is going to bring anybody, is going to file a complaint against anybody for ignoring a subpoena from any committee of Congress except one maybe headed by Lindsey Graham. And so they're not worried about criminal prosecution. Nobody's worried about going to jail. And so they thumb their nose at Congress. You can't send us to jail. You can't do anything to us. Screw you.
And we should say that back in, I guess it was in '88, prior to that, but just in that era you're talking about, the Congress had basically floated the idea of an appointment of independent counsel for possible criminal charges against Ted Olson. Yes. Who was...
and just floated it. They had, in fact, done it. And the D.C. court had appointed a special independent counsel. And Olson, they were just spoiling for the fight. Olson and the others, the other rightists in the administration, they were spoiling for the chance to challenge the constitutionality of the independent counsel law, because from their point of view, just every syllable of the law was an intrusion on the president's constitutional powers. And they moved to quash the subpoena that had been issued to Ted Olson and to declare the independent counsel law unconstitutional. It went to the Supreme Court, and they got their asses handed to them. It was a 7-1 decision. I think Kennedy had just been appointed to the court, and he didn't participate. But it was by Rehnquist. And Rehnquist said, no problem here. There's an inherent conflict of interest. And looking back at the history of the Constitutional Convention, they were the delegates and those others at the time were did not want that strong a president, an unchecked president, and they did want there to be, even if circumstances suggested there was a reason for it, inter-branch appointments so that Congress could appoint people who would serve in the executive branch, which just to the Reaganites, to the rightists in the administration was just apostasy. I mean, they got clobbered, and the only one who went with them was Scalia.
So, okay, so this sets the table. Obviously, the Democrats allowed this law to lapse because in the wake of the Clinton years.
Yeah. Well, it was a Ken Starr thing, but it's not just that. Like everybody in the administration, at some point had a special counsel. And racked up tens or maybe even hundreds of $1,000s of attorney's fees in defending it, in defending the investigations, and a lot of them had very badly damaged reputations. And there was a sense that it had gone too far, but they went from there to nothing.
Right. The baby was thrown out of the bathwater because, and let's talk about the OLC here, because I didn't realize that Rehnquist. You said Barr followed Rehnquist, Scalia, and Olson as the head of the OLC. Wait, all of them were on the head of the OLC? They were all heads of the OLC at one point. That's just nuts to me. I mean, it really, because I guess I have had just obviously John Yoo in the Bush administration with the torture memos and that to me was, I guess, was always framed by the media at the time as sort of an aberration, that it was like that it was a one-off, and it seems like once the special counsel, or I should say the independent counsel law, sunsets, the OLC just becomes completely ripe for some type of corruption, because there's no way to hold anybody to account if the OLC and the DOJ essentially do not see themselves as an independent watchdog of the president.
Correct. And even after an administration changes, it would be very, very difficult to bring a criminal prosecution against someone who had disobeyed the law during the previous administration if there was an OLC, Office of Legal Counsel, opinion saying that you were doing the right thing, that the statute that you were ignoring is unconstitutional, so you should do what the president tells you, and it's essentially a get out of jail free card. It's like a prospective pardon for conduct that has not yet been committed. And yes, the potential for abuse there is enormous, and yes, that potential has been fully realized repeatedly for the last 30 years.
Okay, well, let's talk about what Barr's role in this. So after the Reagan administration loses in all of their attempts, like what, and specifically the Rehnquist decision that you can have, the independent counsel law is no problem. Barr then sort of steps in at that point. And what does he do to sort of limit that? I mean, this is really sort of the beginning of the end on some level, even though we have to wait until after the Clinton administration to get rid of that law.
Yeah, well, he became the first head of the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, in the George H.W. Bush administration. And less than a year after the decision on the independent counsel law, Morrison v. Olson, he wrote an opinion as head of OLC, a memorandum that was distributed widely through the executive branch that said, I think the name of it was 10 common congressional intrusions on presidential power, or something like that. But it was a very belligerent, militant memo that that Congress by statute is intruding on presidential power, and we need to be on the watch for it, and we need to resist it. And the way to resist it isn't by challenging it in court or by vetoing laws, which could be overridden by Congress. It is by simply ignoring it. And really all of the language from that memo has continued to even though that memo was supposedly pulled back in the Clinton administration, that memo has become kind of the touchstone for just about every claim of executive power by the right wing since then.
I mean, isn't that claim basically you and what army?
Pretty much, yeah. They can't do nothing about it, so we can do what we want. I mean, it's kind of given a higher tone. It sounds more principled, but that's basically it. Yeah, they can't challenge us. We're the ones who enforce the laws, and they can say what they want, but we're not going to enforce the law against ourselves. And once they pass their laws, they're done with it, and we decide what it means and whether to enforce it or not.
So, I mean, let's skip ahead here to present day. Once Barr introduces that concept, and he introduces that concept even before the independent counsel law is gone. So not only has he then established, like, we don't have to listen to anybody else, what happens ultimately after the Clinton years, and maybe, I don't know. I mean, this is complete conjecture on my part, but I wonder if part of this push to sort of prove to the Democrats, like, you don't want this independent counsel law because we're going to abuse the heck out of it, was to get rid of it. Because at that point, then there's no other vehicle.
I think it was probably that. Well, that may be true, but it was also just opportunistic. They were trying to do damage. As Hillary Clinton's famous phrase was, a vast right-wing conspiracy. They were seizing upon anything that smelled slightly wrong and suggesting that there was evidence of criminal wrongdoing and asked for a special counsel, and a great many were appointed. But what the piece in American Prospect does lay out a lot of what the OLC opinions claimed in the George W. Bush administration, when I think it was really being pushed by Cheney and what was the other, Addison?
Yes, Addison, yes.
Addison, yeah. I mean, if you saw the movie Vice, I think those guys were just as sinister as they were portrayed in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and you get in a little bit into the Attorney General firing scandal. I mean, this all has to do with the politicization of the Department of Justice.
Right.
But the OLC, to me, the corrupting of that process, I think, is the most problematic, because there's this, and people should understand, the Office of Legal Counsel, just to be clear, it basically functions as the DOJ's in-house Supreme Court. Right? I mean, they decide, except for there's no cert, they don't have to grant cert, and they don't have to, it's just like, we have a question on the legality of doing this. Let's go down the hall, and Bill will tell us at OLC if we can do it or not. They'll write up a memo. They get together. They figure out, theoretically what the legal argument is, but there's no way to question it. Right. So it really doesn't matter how flimsy it all is.
And we, in fact, don't know what most opinions say, because a very small percentage are published.
I mean, this is a really messed up way of doing it. So let me ask you, I have two questions. I mean, one is in the immediate term, where obviously laws that were passed by a Democratic Congress would not be passed by a Republican Senate. What power does the Congress have? I mean, if they had the ability before to appoint an independent counsel, which could then put into legal jeopardy these various players who might say, like, hey, I'm not going to jail for Donald Trump or whoever it is. They don't have that ability anymore. What ability do they have that you perceive them as not using? Is it just inherent contempt?
No, I don't think so. And I promised Dave Day and I'll write another piece for American Prospect on what I think the reforms coming out of this ought to be that are comparable to the post-Watergate reforms. I think there's a Supreme Court case, and in fact a long tradition, and a recent Ninth Circuit decision that says that courts have the inherent power to appoint a special prosecutor for contempt of court, because contempt of court is so important to the court's ability to exert its own power that they can't depend upon the president. So if they turn it over to the executive branch, and the executive branch says, no, we're not going to prosecute that, then the court can appoint an independent counsel to prosecute it for them. I think that, one, they ought to try that now. They ought to petition the court and say, look at this Supreme Court decision on contempt of court. The same thing should apply to contempt of Congress. Appoint a special an independent counsel. But even if they don't do that, or if they try that and they don't win, they ought to enact a statute, a narrower independent counsel statute for contempt of Congress, perjury before Congress, false statements to Congress, obstruction of congressional investigations, conspiracy to do any of that. Because it's very clear that the executive branch cannot be made to do that if they are willing to take the political consequences of not doing it, and which, of course, the Trump administration is doing. And the Trump administration is ignoring all congressional subpoenas. And people who aren't even in the administration. There are these two Russians who were the guys who introduced Giuliani to Ukrainian officials who've been subpoenaed for a congressional investigation. They said, nah, we're not going to give you documents. We're not going to show up. Get the Department of Justice to prosecute us. Good luck with that.
Right.
And that, that's got to change, because until that changes, Congress has effectively no oversight power. And I introduced legislation to do that a decade ago. And on the OLC, Russ Feingold introduced in the Senate, and I introduced a companion, but the same bill in the House that would have required, with certain narrow exceptions, opinions by the Office of Legal Counsel be published, so we could know what they're telling, what they're saying their powers are, at the very least, so Congress can do something about it. And I would go further now, and I would say that an opinion of the Office of Legal Counsel, you cannot say that you relied upon that in a criminal prosecution, as a defense in a criminal prosecution. And that would greatly cut in, I think, to the abuses of the OLC law, the role of the OLC.
Well,
and a set of House members, I should tell you who they are. It's somewhat bipartisan. I can't remember who they are, but it's within the last 2 weeks, has introduced legislation very like what Russ Feingold and I introduced a decade ago.
Interesting. And what of inherent contempt? I mean, assuming that Congress doesn't pass anything in the short term, can Nancy Pelosi say, all right, we're doing this? You don't, Mike Pompeo, you don't give us the documents? I'm sending the sergeant at arms to go out and put you in the congressional dungeon or whatever it is, or we're just going to, you're going to rack up $2,000 a day in fines, and at one point, we're going to go to court and you can roll the dice, because maybe in a year you're going to owe, I don't know, $300,000 or something. Yeah.
There's also legislation to do that, I think. I'm not sure it's been introduced, but there's an independent group, something like Good Government Now, I think is the name of it, proposed it, but with a limit of $25,000 for a civil fine. And that was part of the bill that I introduced a decade ago as well, to allow civil fines. The problem with inherent contempt with executive branch officials is you're sending out the Capitol Police and the Sergeant at Arms to take somebody into custody who's got protection by law enforcement officers from the executive branch. And I really don't like the idea of a firefight, an armed confrontation between the Capitol Police and the FBI or the Secret Service. There's got to be a better way to do it than that. But with respect to others who aren't in the executive branch, and both of them, by the way, would be assuming that they were taking orders, proper orders from above.
Right.
The Capitol Police to take somebody in custody, the Secret Service not to allow someone to be taken into custody. But with respect to others, I have suggested within the last year during this confrontation that, like the accounting firm, Lazar's, use inherent contempt against them. And they haven't been saying they won't turn over stuff. I mean, the non-government officials are saying, yeah, courts just tell us what to do and we'll do it. We have got no interest in going to jail over this. But there are problems, there are limits to inherent contempt. There are obviously, and by the way, I thought Jerry Nadler got unfairly criticized for not doing more about Corey Lewandowski's testimony, where, he was just a thug, thumbed his nose, and there isn't anything that's equivalent to a bench warrant. There was no way that Jerry could have said to the Sergeant at Arms, okay, go detain him until his attitude is improved, and then we'll hear his testimony. There really isn't a way to do that, but there should be a way to get at least some potential witnesses in a way that they have to worry about it.
Yeah, well, I hope at the very least what comes out of that is some type of reform package for this that passes in Congress. Well, it's a fascinating piece, and would love to have you back on when you do write that piece for the American Prospect on the solutions. Former Representative Brad Miller, the piece is The 40-Year War. In the American Prospect, we'll put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much again for your time.
All right, thanks, Sam. All right.
Welcome back to the show, folks. Check out that piece in the American Prospect. Very good, very important.